Our next speaker is Megha Sundara from UCLA, and she's going to speak about the development of word segmentation in bilingual infants. Okay.
So I'm going to ask you to turn your attention to babies and how babies learn language. That's what I'm going to be talking about for the next 15 minutes. And it's a good example of the breadth of talks that you're hearing, that you have to completely switch gears at this point. That's what it is. This is your first try. Second try, rather. Okay. So as it turns out, this work that I'm going to be talking about today is all joint with Victoria Matteo. Victoria's at the back there. So if you want to find either her or me to talk about it later, that would be great. Turns out finding words in running speech is a hard task. Why? Because there aren't silences. I'm talking, and I'm actually not stopping after every word that I say, but yet you know that I'm talking in words, okay? So this is a big problem for language learners and babies, particularly, okay? Turns out we also know a lot about how babies learn English, okay? The way babies learn English is by treating strong syllables, okay, syllables with full vowels, with stress, as onsets, as the beginnings of words. It's a very good strategy for English because 90% of content words in English start with a strong syllable. So this is a great place to start. English learning babies, that's where they start, okay? When they start finding words, they find words with strong syllables. They treat them as beginnings of words. So they find words like doctor. These are called trochees. And they can find those, they can segment them out of running speech, but they fail to segment words like guitar, where the strong syllable is at the end. It's because they don't hear a lot of those, okay? If the reason why babies are doing this is because in their language they don't hear a lot of it, you'd think if you change their input, they can start pulling out words like guitar. And there's some evidence that that is the case. So in an artificial language learning setting, when you bring a baby into the lab and you play them words that have stress on the last syllable, a list of them, turns out they show some evidence that they can pull out words that have stress on the last syllable, okay? But this happens naturally when babies hear other languages too, because every language is not like English with words that start with a stressed syllable. So we're going to look today at the case of babies who are hearing two languages, English and Spanish. So Spanish has a very different profile of where strong syllables are present in the language. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. So as you all know, Spanish is different from English, at least in one way, very prominently in its rhythm. It's considered to be syllable timed, as opposed to English that has stress at thought to have stress at a more regular intervals. Turns out that in Spanish, bisyllabic words, or two-syllable words, are the most common form of word you're going to encounter. This is different from English. In English, most of the words are monosyllables, okay? So the two-syllable words in Spanish tend to have a more even distribution. 60% of them have stress at the beginning, and 40% of them have stress on the second syllable, okay? So this is a more diverse stress profile than you would see in English. So it's also important to know that in Spanish, lexical stress, or stress, whether it's on the first syllable or the second syllable, is quite productive. You see it for marking grammar. So this is not something that is esoteric or uncommon. You see this in everyday words. Okay? So here's the experiment that we did. We tested Spanish and English learning 8-month-old babies, and we asked whether they could find English iambs. So words like guitar, which have stress on the final syllable. Now notice that there's already research showing that just monolingual babies who hear just English cannot segment these at 8 months of age. Okay? I want to tell you two things before I tell you more about the experiment. One is, who are these bilingual babies? Who are we calling bilingual, and why are we calling them bilingual? Okay? Typically, when parents come into our lab to participate in a study, we do a detailed parental questionnaire. We ask them what are the languages the baby hears, who does the baby interact with on a regular basis, and based on that information, we assign a number. What percentage of the time does the baby hear English or Spanish? Parents give their own assessment as well, and at the end of a parental questionnaire, usually it matches up pretty closely with whatever our assessment is. So we categorize babies as bilingual if they hear anywhere between 5 and 95% Spanish. So this is a wide range of Spanish exposure. In fact, I'm going to break up this data into two parts, babies who hear more Spanish and who hear less Spanish, so more than 45% and less than 45, okay? Just so you can see that what are the effects in each of these groups, okay? The way we test babies is using a procedure called the head-turn preference procedure, and I'll tell you about that now. Oh, before that, okay, so the stimuli that we have are all recorded in American English by a female native American English speaker. We've got paragraphs and word lists, and the words that we're asking babies to segment is beret, guitar, device, and surprise, all of which have stress on the second syllable, okay? So let me tell you how the procedure works. The baby, when they come into the lab, she sits on her parent's lap in the middle of a three-sided pegboard booth. That's what you're seeing, okay? On each of those pegboard booths, there's a flashing light, okay? The center light, the center panel, with the beginning of a trial, the center panel light flashes, and its only job is to attract the baby's attention to the center of the screen. Once the baby's gaze is centered, one of the side lights flashes. The baby turns to track that light, and when that light flashes, when the baby's looking at it, the auditory stimulus starts to play. We play them stories and word lists. They stay on as long as the baby's looking at that light. Baby looks away, it stops. This is called contingent looking. So basically, the baby's controlling how long they listen to stimuli. Testing is done in two phases, the familiarization phase and the test phase. In the familiarization phase, a baby is going to hear two stories. In this case, the baby is hearing the beret story and the guitar story, okay? So they hear each of these stories till they listen to it for about 45 seconds each. Once they've done that, we play them just repeated repetitions of the isolated words. They hear beret repeated over and over again, guitar repeated over and over again, and device and surprise, so all four lists. So notice, if you're able to segment beret and guitar from the paragraphs, two of these words are familiar and two are novel. You've never heard them before. So what we measure is how long babies like to listen to each pair of these words. If they listen significantly longer to the familiar words, they've shown us that they can actually pull these out. If they cannot segment them, these are all equally unfamiliar and they should treat them the same. Here are our results. So on the vertical axis, you have how long babies listen to each kind of trial. And the two bars, the hashed bars are how long they listen to the familiar words, the ones that we had just familiarized them with. And the white bars are for the novel ones they had never heard before, at least in the experiment. Turns out both these groups of infants, whether they had more than 45% Spanish or less than 45% Spanish, are able to treat strong syllables as offsets of words, so as the ending of the word. So they can pull out a word like guitar, okay? So notice this is very different from monolingual babies who can't do this. Monolingual English learning babies can't do this, okay? So why did these bilingual kids succeed? If you're wondering, maybe they don't know the difference between Spanish and English and they're just mixing them up, I can tell you that that is not the case, okay? Turns out infants can discriminate English from Spanish based on rhythm from as young as when they're newborns, and they don't even need experience with either English or Spanish to do that. It is something humans can do, okay? So it's not that they're confused and they just think it's all the same thing. So what we think it is that there's some evidence that they're transferring what they hear in one language to another. So from Spanish, they get the idea that strong syllables can be offsets, and that's what they're using in their English. So to get more evidence for transfer, we actually want to try it the other way as well. If there's transfer from Spanish input to what they're learning in English, maybe they can use what they know from their English into their Spanish as well. So to test for that, we again tested 8-month-old Spanish and English learning babies, but this time in Spanish, on Spanish trochees. That means Spanish words that have stress on the initial syllable, like salsa, okay? So we had an experimental group, but this time we wanted to make it as hard as possible for our bilingual babies. So these babies just have very little exposure to Spanish. They have less than 45% exposure to Spanish. So a little bit, okay? So we also have two control groups in this experiment. We have monolingual English learning babies and monolingual Spanish learning babies. The reason is there's not a lot of research out there on how babies find Spanish words. Surprise, okay? So we had to do that ourselves, so we have that data. So who are we calling monolingual? Babies who have more than 95% exposure to just Spanish or English. Usually it's 100%, okay? The 95% is, there's maybe one or two babies that have that little, It's monolingual. So we tested babies using the exact same method that I had introduced to you, the head-turn preference procedure. This time our stimuli were recorded by a native Mexican Spanish speaker, and that's because the majority of the parents that report to us the dialects of the babies is usually Los Angeles / Mexico, depending on what they pick, okay? So our target words this time were salsa, gancho, benda, and gesto. So it's like the strong syllables are the onsets. Exact same procedure. We have familiarization with 2 paragraphs, and then we have testing on isolated words where they hear all 4, too familiar and too novel. Here are our results. I'm going to walk you through the monolingual data first, okay? It's no surprise that monolingual English babies can't find Spanish 2-syllable words in Spanish, okay? No surprise. Here's the surprise. Monolingual Spanish babies don't actually find 2-syllable words that begin with a stressed syllable in Spanish either. Now, before you go down the rabbit warren of who are these babies, what are they hearing, is it SES? Similar findings have been reported from Spanish learning babies in Barcelona, okay? So something about how stress is instantiated in Spanish, maybe because it's related to syllable weight or something, or because it's not a clear pattern in Spanish because they hear both kinds of words, makes this the case, okay? So it's now consistent across labs. Finding 2-syllable words for monolingual Spanish learning babies is hard, just is. Here are our data. Oh, did it really not save that? Okay. This is where I show you actually the other data. The bilingual babies can do that, okay? For some reason, my animation hasn't saved, which is why you cannot see the thing coming off. Give me just a second. It reads. There. This will do it. This is where I'll find out that I am not a Mac person. Okay. Or it doesn't come on. It does. Just one second. Apologies. There. Okay, good, you can see it. Great. So what you're seeing here is that the bilingual babies actually can do this. Okay? So this is surprising. They're not getting this from either of their monolingual counterparts in that way. It is learning English, which allows them to use stressed or strong syllable as word onsets that's helping them actually to segment words in Spanish. Okay. So here's what we conclude from these studies. So bilingual 8-month-olds can segment bisyllabic words in both languages, in English and Spanish. Okay? They're treating strong syllables as onsets or as offsets. Okay? They're doing it in English, unlike their English monolingual peers. They can segment English iambs or words with stress on the second syllable. And they can do this in Spanish, where the stress syllable is the onset, unlike their monolingual peers. Okay? So basically what we're seeing is that development of word segmentation in these babies is not independent in their 2 languages. There is some kind of an interconnection, or what we think of as transfer. So that's what we're going to argue for. Thank you. Yes. Please.
I'm just curious about the time course.
Yeah.
So if you look at older babies,
Yeah.
Do you see a difference between the monolinguals and the bilinguals in being able to do this?
So we have not tested bilinguals at the older age because they already succeed at this point. But with monolingual English learning infants, we know that they can segment words like guitar at 11 months of age. So the monolingual babies do that. So the bilingual babies, we didn't test them because they already succeeded. So it is possible there's a U-shaped thing where it goes away and comes back, but we haven't looked for it.
Or it might just be also stronger in the bilinguals.
Could be totally stronger too. Yeah.
Actually, I'm not really sure how to formulate this question, but did you take into account differences in intonation, how intonation impacts or relates to stress in Spanish, as well as vowel quality?
So yes, vowel quality difference. The question that, to put it in the wider context, turns out in Spanish, The biggest cue to a stressed syllable is usually duration, but it's still very subtle. It's much smaller than in English. English stressed syllables are whoppingly long. They are also usually louder. They have a higher pitch, and they also have a full vowel. So in English, it's like overkill. How many cues can I give you to stress? And they're all there. And Spanish is a lot more subtle that way. It's usually duration, and it's way smaller than in English. So it's actually, in a way, interesting that our bilingual infants can segment even in Spanish with that reduced cue. We think that is a reason why the monolingual kids have a hard time, because they do not, that's one of the things. The profile, the acoustic profile of what constitutes as a strong syllable is way more subtle in Spanish, and that's one of the things that contributes to it as well.
Hi. So my question was actually related to that somewhat. So I was wondering, do we know that it's transfer, or is it the nature of the input, the Spanish input, related to intonational? Is there some kind of sort of more English, or is the input to the bilingual infants different than the input to the monolingual Spanish infants in Spanish?
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, what Barbara is talking about is that maybe the Spanish that these babies, the bilingual babies, are hearing is just different, okay? They're hearing it as maybe being more prominent for some reason in their input. We can't rule that out, okay? But what makes me doubt that is that our stimuli were not recorded our stimuli were recorded by someone who came to the US when she was 18 or 17, and her Spanish is perfectly native Spanish-like. So there were no cues in our stimuli that would have utilized that. But it is possible that their learning was enhanced because they had a different kind of an input there. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, sorry. Just for information, very interesting data. Were there individual differences among your infants?
Yeah. So there
because
are
we're working on the idea that there may be sort of individual differences that precede the bilingual exposure that might.
So the numbers underneath on the plot tell you how many kids in that group showed the same pattern as what you're seeing on the averages. Okay. So essentially, what you're seeing there is for the bilingual group with less than 45% exposure, about 11 kids out of 18 showed the same pattern. So the rest of the 7 don't. In the other groups, it's smaller. Now, if we go look at the English IAM study, you will also see it's a little more homogeneous, but it's, we should be able to do this with this. Okay. Okay, here also you're seeing 15 out of 18 kids in one group and 11 out of 18 in the other. So that's the kind of, now mind you, when I say they're in the right direction, that means they listen longer to the familiar stimuli than the novel stimuli in that, but the extent to which they do that is different. So there are individual differences and you can measure them. So this is not the best method to measure individual differences because it's one trial, but yes, welcome.
We need to go on, but thank you very much.
Thank you. There.